Okay, I think we're about to go live. I don't think
Let's see here.
oh, okay, we're there. I found it myself. I can multitask on this stuff. It's been frightening. I'm finally getting to a point where I can actually do 2 or 3 things.
I'm impressed.
You're a millennial.
Oh my God, this is absolutely amazing. I don't know where Dina is. Okay. Did you text her for me, Wanda? Or would you?
Yep, I'll do it now.
Okay, great. Because she's not here and it's 1:28.
I see her box. There she
Oh,
is.
there she is. We were starting to wonder where you were. You're unmuted.
Scrambling looking for the link.
Oh, okay.
I have so many of them.
Yeah, well, today you would. You would have at least 2, if not 3. So I apologize for that. But
Oh, yeah, what about this?
when we set this up, we set it up as recurring, or more recently we did. And as a result, we wound up with 2 registration for today's episode. So there's at least 100 people that had to be ported over to the larger segment of registrations. And so I apologize to everybody for that, but it's kind of one of those things, still getting real familiar with this technology of Zoom. So, but we have all of our panelists here, and it's 1:29, and I'll kick it off in a few minutes. Any questions, concerns?
Yeah, what kind of, I usually do this with you.
Well, you're still invited to do it with me, but you just happen to be one of my interviewees today.
Yeah, well, I might answer some questions and ask some too.
Yeah, you might ask some. You certainly will think of the ones I didn't ask. So we're still sharing this this honor. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My clock says that it is 1:30. And I want to begin by saying welcome to all of you that have taken time out of your schedules to join us. We are absolutely exceptionally honored. Both the Black Pearl Society Incorporated, of which Wanda LeGrand and Dina Hayes and myself and Joanne, we happen to be 4 of the people that are part of the Black Pearls. You can go on our website, www.blackpearlsociety.org. We invite you to go there and check us out, what we do and what we're about, because we are essentially a group created with the express intent of really keeping race on the table. A group of African-American women who have elected to do that. But we're also representing the Black Pearls, actually in collaboration with the Racial Equity Institute. And I hope that most of you perhaps have come to this setting, this hour or hour and a half, and this episode as a result of your relationship and familiarity with the Racial Equity Institute. We began this series largely because one of the interesting experiences that we have as we move across the United States addressing structural and institutional racism with all manifestation of institution, system, and corporation is that people are frequently asking, after having gone through our trainings and through the groundwater, what do people do? What's the next step? What can we do? And so what we have shared, but often are limited in terms of time of getting into really significant detail, is how different groups in different parts of the United States have been organizing with this analysis. And that is, I mean, literally from groups in California, groups in Florida, groups in Indiana, groups in New Orleans, groups just across the United States, and in Maine, in Massachusetts, and different places. So this opportunity now, as a part of this Zoom has given us an opportunity for you to meet people across the United States who who are organizing in their communities with this analysis. Today, though, is a special segment. And here's why and how we happened upon this segment. And that is that most of you know that really, while we are in the midst of a pandemic, that in fact, the killing of George Floyd on May 25th just ushered in a whole new social challenge and arrangement. And what we've seen across the United States in terms of people speaking out, people getting out, and people representing the issue of racism has been enormous. One of the things that Dina and I marveled at one point was seeing Governor Cuomo, seeing various governors and various mayors and various attorney generals, CEOs of corporation, for the first time in many of our experiences, saying directly and not hesitating that we have an issue of structural and systemic racism in this country. Our concern and our hesitation is that while we are so excited and know that many of our organizations have had a profound impact and influence on the ability of them being able to situate that, we are a bit concerned with really how in-depth their analysis really goes. And so today's episode, really, we've invited some people whom we respect very highly and who we know are doing work in their respective corners of the world. And so really our guest for today, and actually she's a guest and she's an interviewer, but I'll start with Dina Hayes Green, and we have Suzanne Plissick, both co-founders of the Racial Equity Institute. We have with us today Bay Love, who has actually been very much a partner to the Racial Equity Institute in terms of the work as we've moved across the country. But himself is also a founder of a new organization called Impactive. And so we want to lift him up. We want to welcome Judge Louis Trosh, who was with us a few weeks ago, who actually is a part of Race Matters for Juvenile Justice in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we're grateful to have him back, representative of the court systems of Charlotte, Mecklenburg County. We want to welcome Sean Barney, who is, again, a part of the New Orleans Campaign for an Equitable New Orleans movement. Himself a businessman there and developer there in New Orleans, was with us a few weeks ago with his team, but we've invited him back. And we're super excited to also have with us today Joanne Pierce, who is a representative of the Durham County Public System, specifically related to health, and who we had the honor and opportunity some years ago, first meeting in Texas, but now she's a resident of North Carolina. So you have an esteemed panel of guests who we feel are some of the people that we trust, how should I say, profoundly, to lead us into a conversation on structural and institutional racism. So I'm going to start by asking each of you, if you will, I'll start, Dina, I'm actually going to put you in the position of starting by telling us a little bit about who you are, about your work with the Racial Equity Institute, and just how you've come to this work. And we're going to do that with each of you as panelists, wanting you to center who you are as connected to this work that addresses structural and institutional racism. You're muted, Dina.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. So I'm Dina Hayes Green. I'm a trainer and organizer, co-founder of the Racial Equity Institute. We're a national multiracial organization. We're based in Greensboro, North Carolina, but we work with partners and organizers all over the country that are interested in, partnering and doing this work together. I'm also a member of the Guilford County Board of Education. I'm the current chair of the school board in Greensboro, North Carolina. We're the third largest school district in our state. And I'm also chair of the International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina, the site of the 1960 sit-ins at the Woolworth lunch counter. And sad to say that, 50, 60, 70 years later, we are still confronting and facing these issues around race. And I think it has a lot to do with the topic of this particular Beyond This Moment series, about how race is so systemic that no matter who's still around, who's running the organization, who is populating the organizations, that the outcomes will still be the evidence of the arrangement of race in all of our systems. So glad to be here.
Suzanne, I'm going to ask if you would be so kind as to follow Dina and tell us a little bit about your segue into this work.
You're muted too.
since she introduced the Racial Equity Institute, so that makes it easy. I have the great honor, Suzanne Plissick, I'm a community organizer and trainer, and the great honor to follow Dina Hayes Green in our work in Greensboro and across this nation. So that has been what we have done for, it's really a little over 10 years, Dina, as I look back to the different names we had in the early days. But that's what I do and continue to do.
I'm going to have you, if you will, Bay, would you follow Suzanne and talk a little bit about your segue into this work of addressing structural and institutional racism?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I grew up in Maine, which is one of the whitest states in the country, sort of with the illusion that we didn't have a race problem there because it was so white. And so I actually, kind of classic story in some ways, I went to college and, was around a more diverse group than I'd ever been in. And 9/11 and the Iraq War happened while I was in college. So I really started looking at the world in terms of power and violence and war and trying to understand it better. And as the more I studied that, the more I felt like race was one part of our history and our structure in the United States and therefore in the world that I had never been cued into. So that's led me to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, ended up working with the People's Institute for a long time there, and then moved to North Carolina to do a business degree and a policy degree and try to do this work at a systems level, and got connected with REI and have been delighted to be a part of REI ever since, and then also do some more consulting, strategy consulting type work with Impacted. So really glad to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Bay. Joanne, how about you jumping in here?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I come to this work through government, first working in state government, and then now working in local government. And I will say that after having been exposed for about 10 years now with these fine group of trainers and folks who really provided that narrative, a different analysis that we do have, because certainly we do have an analysis currently. And so I would say that coming to this work from that lens of government and public health, after having led 2 state offices of minority health in Texas and then North Carolina, and working in local government, now more than ever, this conversation is critical, and this work has always been critical and very important. And I'm so glad that there is national conversation about this. So that's and it's definitely my work in public health, which often we see disparities and disproportionality, and just understanding that all of our systems must really get this racial clarity so that we can work together to improve outcomes for all of the people that we serve and work with. Thank you.
Dr. Trosh, I'll have you jump in now. Judge Trosh.
So my name's Lou Trosh. I'm a Superior Court judge now. I was a district court judge for 20 years before I joined the Superior Court bench about 1.5 years ago. And to be honest, I came to this work after coming into being a judge thinking, well, I'm neutral. This isn't really my issue. I treat everybody fairly. I have my eyes blinded and I seek the truth. But over the years, I, and with the help of a lot of other colleagues and friends of mine through Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, we came together and realized that our system and us as judges are part of a system that is both designed to and continues to, even now when our rules have been changed to be race neutral, treats people of different races and ethnicities differently. And so that I'm part of the problem. And I want to read, if I could, real briefly, our Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Sherry Beasley, Chief Judge Justice Sherry Beasley, recently issued a statement that I think is profound in acknowledging that the courts bear a role in institutional racism and systemic inequities. And so just some excerpts of that. I can't read the whole thing, and it's so beautifully written in a statement, a challenge really to all of us as judges. But in part, she says, we must develop a plan for accountability in our courts. Even the best judges must be trained to recognize our own biases. We have to be experts, not just in the law, but in equity. Equity that recognizes the difficult truths about our shared past. The data also overwhelmingly bears out the truth of lived experiences. In our courts, African Americans are more harshly treated, more severely punished, and more likely to be presumed guilty. We must openly acknowledge the disparities that exist and are all too often perpetuated by our justice system. We must come together to firmly and loudly commit to the declaration that all people are created equal. We must do more than just speak that truth. We must live it every day in our courtroom. Our pledge to you today is that we will do better. We must do better. We will do better. And so that's really powerful for the Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court to put something on the table that judges have been loath in the right word, but scared, I think, to admit because we see ourselves as neutral. And so that's been a tremendous impetus for all of us in the judiciary and a challenge to all of us to both acknowledge our role in this system.
I want to thank you for that, Judge Trosh. That was a really chilling moment for me some weeks ago to hear Judge Beasley actually deliver that. And I certainly hope that it is the impetus, and part of what I hope that today's conversation will be a lot about is lifting up the level at which we expect and hope for accountability on the part of our systems, and how and whether or not that is happening. But I don't want to be remiss in allowing Sean, if you will, jump in and introduce yourself and how you are connected to this work.
Sure. First of all, I'll introduce myself the way Dina says I should introduce myself. I'm an organizer, apparently. Professionally, I run a real estate development and structured finance firm in New Orleans, but I'm also a co-founder of the Campaign for Equity New Orleans, which I co-host sessions for systems leaders along with 4 other entrepreneurs. And the objective of our work is to make New Orleans the most equitable city in America. And so we put together the campaign to educate, connect, and mobilize systems leaders and influencers throughout the city in order to address areas of systematic racism and build a more equitable future for New Orleans. And so in the past 4 years, we've had about 1,200 leaders participate in REI 2-day trainings and/or groundwaters. And really the core of the way we approach the work really is sort of rooted in the power analysis that REI provides, and really looking to engage people who are powerful, who are non-traditional stakeholders in the conversation, and sort of bring them into the process, and frankly, to bring them in on CNO's terms. And so that's been a very powerful effort for sort of orienting the community generally, but particularly at this moment. So very pleased to be here and appreciate the invitation to talk a little bit more about it.
So I've been thank you, Sean, and thanks to all of you, to the panelists. And I want to start this way because this has possibly been, in spite of all of, one of the things I've always been inspired by in the Chinese language, they say that one of the symbols representing crisis simultaneously is the same symbol or image that is written to represent opportunity. And so in many ways, in spite of this pandemic and in spite of the killing of George Floyd, which George Floyd is representative of so many and too many, but we still find ourselves, however we got here, at a moment where I feel as though we have the nation's attention. As a matter of fact, I'll even point out today, we have more guests today than we've had for any episode. But we're talking about structural and institutional racism. And I am just not so convinced that everyone that utters that deeply and profoundly really understands that and what it means. So I want each of you, if you will, to articulate how structural and institutional racism either show up in the work that you are doing or has shown up in the institution in which you are serving. And Dina, I'm gonna, if you will, I'm gonna let you kick that off. You may be muted because we don't hear you.
I've been thinking about this a lot because I like you noticed the shift in language it was used and is being used around the disproportionality and disparities with COVID-19 diagnosis and deaths, and likely with all of the things that have ignited the uprising and the unrest and the frustration and the injustice around the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so on. And I do think that, just our understanding, because of our exposure, our shared education, has moved us from seeing racism as not just the way that we interact with each other, whether or not you say the N-word, whether we harbor any racial animus, whether we want to move out of our neighborhood if a Black person moves in. We could stop doing all of that, and we would still have the outcomes that we have in education and the achievement gap, or as Joanne talked about, racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare. And so I would say, we always try to find these useful, sort of allegories to help people understand complex things, because one of the mistakes that is made around race and racism is we've made it something simple. And if it's something simple, then, we can ask questions about, well, how do we fix it? What do we do next? What are the solutions? And so I think about race and racism, particularly around systemic and institutional racism, as they're the children of structural and cultural racism, and then individual racism's the grandbaby, and so that there's a relationship between the three, that systemic and institutional racism are a byproduct of structural and cultural racism. And so that it's this sort of complex interplay between how culture and structure have so shaped our society in regards to race, how they have been embedded in policy and behavior, and norms and standards and values, and so entrenched and so embedded that they can produce outcomes when the people who are in charge of those institutions are long gone, when the people who populate those institutions are long gone. And so, I want to invite people to detach from looking for some answers and solutions, to leave this presentation being more curious than you've ever been about what this is, and then commit to a process to understanding, instead of looking for us to find some, quick, neatly wrapped, explanation of how systemic racism lives in our institutions.
Thank you, Sean. You come at this probably, and there's an estimate on my part that you come at it a little different, because I don't situate you inside of a structured, arranged institution, but you're very much a part of one. So can you talk about what has been, you guys caught on fire very quickly as you got exposed to an analysis. So can you talk about how that shows up, particularly in the field of endeavor that you pursue?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, the analysis is so profound. And I always sort of say in our sessions, when you really sort of put up the slide, I think on banking and finance and mortgages, I said that, I'm very fortunate in my upbringing, but that's the first time I really saw myself as a statistic. And I sort of said in my field of finance, where in real estate, where everybody looks at me and says, you're doing well and you have some of these material things or whatnot. And I always sort of say, if you have, a white developer with 2 degrees, roughly the same age, he's here and I'm here. And so it's all relative. And I think that just was so profound for me, and sort of breaking through that this is an arrangement that is designed to produce a certain outcome. And so it, was very clear to me. And I joke with you guys that, again, I went to historically Black college and university. My father ran the local urban league. I was on the National Urban League board. I'm Black. And there was so much that I didn't know. And so, to your question, Monica, I think it is embedded in all the systems. And I think what gave us sort of profound courage and somewhat audacity to think we can move a city and a community is really underscoring what Dina said. It's not really about, individual hatred or bigotry informs the ideas, informs the policy. It's the reverse, which is sort of hard to see unless you really study this thing. It's the systems that sort of perpetuate the ideas, that sort of, perpetuate the individual sort of points of view. Redlining in my line of work in real estate is a great example of that, right? That was a federal policy that sort of reinforced certain ideas that people didn't care about their communities, which sort of, informed other folks' individual sort of behaviors and points of view to other folks. And so, it certainly shows up in my world in real estate, in banking, but it's very clear to me in education and in health. And what I've found, I think that thing that gives us the most energy and juice is that understanding is a tremendous organizing mechanism. And that has really been very helpful in New Orleans, that race is the thing you want to organize around. And, that used to be the topic that was so, that folks didn't want to touch. And so we're able to lean in. And as I said, sort of bring people into the conversation, our terms, and say, no, this is the way you organize the community. This has moral as well as economic currency for our community. This is how you define a 21st century city. And so, when you sort of start from that position, things sort of fall in line. And as you said, we went from, inviting you guys down, you and Bay, I think, came down our very first session, and not knowing why we were inviting you other than we wanted to see it, to sort of saying we're going to do this every month, to saying we're going to have 1,000 leaders, to now saying we're going to touch 25,000 people with the message of an equitable recovery over this next year, to, of course, as you guys know, talking about a race for equity. So I think that is sort of how we got it and really move forward.
Bay and Suzanne, I want to bring the two of you in this way. And I'm going to position this because Sean is a usual suspect. He's a Black man in America. And so whether we agree with Sean or not about racism exists and it's a problem, he's a usual suspect. Joanne is a usual suspect. Dina's a usual suspect, and so am I. And so there is something significant about, Bay, you say you come from the whitest state in the country, Maine. And Susanna, my first meeting of you some years ago, my first visit to North Carolina is that I did. I have had the experience, however that gets interpreted, of looking at some white people and saying, I'm trying to figure out why you're here. Because it could be read that with the opportunities that have existed and where you get situated, that this is not your struggle, and that perhaps you shouldn't be here. So I'm going to let either one of you take it that will, but I want to talk about your connections and how you segue really into this work as a personal, even albeit what's become even a professional, impetus. Suzanne, Bay's pointing to you and you're muted. Let's unmute you.
I've had this question a lot. People seem to look at me and say, who are you? Why are you here? How in the world did you get started in this work? And I don't have just a nice linear path to describe, but I can tell you a little bit about that. A number of years ago, you can tell it was a long time ago. I was one of many people who saw the pain and suffering. White people who could see the pain and suffering. And I wasn't unique in that. I wasn't unique in that. And could see that there was need in the world that was heartbreaking, and went about doing what most of us do at first, which was to meet the need. Get the soup kitchen set up, get the clothing center set up, get the medical assistance set up, get the free pharmacy set up, on and on and on and on. And I did that, and I did that, and I did that. And of course, it becomes evident if you're paying attention, and a lot of people are, they just don't know where to go next, that's not solving any problems. And that the need grew the next year, and the need grew the next year, in spite of all that was being done to meet it. And with that, I decided, all on my own, without asking anybody else, because I was, after all, white and arrogant. I decided that the thing to do was change policy. That's what we needed to do. Policies needed to change, and when those policies changed, that need we would get at the root of that need, and that need wouldn't be there anymore. So I worked for a long time on policy and lobbying and policy, and it didn't change. And so pretty soon it was clear to those paying attention, and many were, that there was something deeper about this, that we had a narrative and a story that absolutely lived in the way we did things in this country, and it was white. And it was built on our preferences as white people. and that we had to begin to address that because it was all about race. It was all about race. We had every system that we have today in this country by the time we ratified the Constitution of the United States. So you need only ask, who created them? For whom? Every institution, by the time we argued Brown, you need only ask, who created them? For whom? And when you know that, your work changes, your worldview changes, how you go about it changes. And I was blessed, enormously blessed, to come upon people who actually had experience and knowledge in this and actually knew what was going on and worked from an analysis of race that we continue to work from today. So that's the long, short version.
Thanks, Suzanne. Bay?
Yeah, no, I appreciate everything that Suzanne said and would echo similar things from myself. I think that, as I explained that I, really started thinking about race, it was interesting. I didn't come just thinking about race. I really was trying to understand power and war. And I had buddies that didn't have other economic opportunities in Maine. And so would get, it wasn't like a formal draft, but would decide to go into the military and then be traumatized. And, there's just all kinds of stuff going on. And it seemed like people were kind of choosing, which way we were going. But remember, the majority of the American people were actually polling against the war, but we were going anyway. So I started to think, hey, wait a second, there's some strings being pulled here behind the scenes that I just can't see. And I just felt like, for whatever reason, I wanted to live a life where I was trying to make a difference in the world for the better. And I felt that in order to do that, I needed to understand sort of the structures and the systems behind what seemed to be happening at the surface. And that's why racism was really so key. But as I think about it today and what's going on in the country, I want to say this about structure and structural racism, that to me, it's when we say racism is the groundwater, really what that means is that racism is baked into the structure of our society. And it's not only race, right? I mean, it's what's also built into our structure is wealth inequity like we've never seen in any empire in the modern world outside of the United States. And that means that even in Maine, which is the whitest state, or they're about close to, right? That means we have a lot of white people in this state who are working their tails off and still can't make ends meet. And I say that there's got to be a structure doing that because, Monica, as you often ask, are there enough resources in the state of Maine to take care of everybody, white folks, black folks, indigenous folks? There certainly are, but that's not happening. Why is that? I think because there's an arrangement that goes from everything about whose money, like who has money, how they maintain it, who gets to create the popular narrative that the stories that we tell ourselves to justify it, who controls who gets education and not, what we think about poor white people, what we think about black people, all of that stuff is sort of put together like bricks in a wall that then creates something that's very hard to kind of get our arms all around. So that's what structure is to me. And structural racism means that race, this made up concept, was fundamental to setting up the wealth inequity the way that we have it, and is the fundamental thing to maintaining. And we could talk about that over the course of the panel, I suppose, but it's at every possible turn in American history when we have tried to develop something as the people of the United States have tried to come together to create something more equitable, more humane, and more sustainable. I study it, and the more I study it, the more I'm convinced race is literally the thing that comes in and prevents us from doing that just about every time. And I think it's happening right now. And if we don't see that and we focus on the individual like Dina talked about, if we focus on, help people of color like Suzanne talked about, and we're not able to see the structure and the way that structure is impacting all of us, I think we're liable to miss the boat again.
Thank you, Bay. And Joanne, you came in through the door of health. So I want, if you will, to talk about the structure and arrangement of race and its impact on the health systems of this country in the way that you know it.
So as you asked that question, I immediately went to thinking about a time when I was leading the State Office of Minority Health in Texas, and some researchers came because they wanted to talk about and maybe explore and examine the underutilization of children primarily on Medicaid from receiving their services. And so I did take in that meeting, and I asked, what do you want to look into? And they said, well, we want to learn more about why there's this underutilization of services when people do have health coverage, especially children. And I said, well, this has been done many times. So what will happen differently? How will you go through the methodology? And they were seeking our support and help, and knowing that, that we had some racial clarity, that they wanted to check that out. And they said, well, we're going to call and do these cold calls. And I said, well, had that been done before? And it was really about our race neutral policies, right, that show up by race and impact Black and Brown families. And so we talked about that. And we went to 3 particular areas where there was where the highest underutilization of these services. And it was in 3 parts of Texas. And one of the most amazing things happened in terms of being clear about how our policies, race neutral policies, impact people by race and ethnicity. And we went to one of these focus group sessions, as we all are familiar, just because, of course, if children aren't going to these child visits or receiving health care, of course, that's going to impact their health and everything else. And so one of the most amazing things happened. And again, working with the researchers, they wanted to ask people, of course, why are you not utilizing services? And so we kind of tried to work with them and say, that's not ideal, coming into someone's community, asking those questions. And so we asked, how do you experience our programs and services? And immediately, just a random woman in this audience who came to hear what we had to say, she said, well, let me tell you about how I experienced your programs and services. And she talked about the policy. She said, I know that you all had great intentions when you were in your boardroom, trying to figure out how to help, this underutilization. And one of the things that, of course, in government, they came up with, it was a transportation service. So that, parents who didn't have transportation could put their child on, travel with the family and go to the appointment. And she said, well, I'm sure you had good intentions, but let me talk to you how this policy works. And she talked about that first, you have to have a 72-hour arrangement to schedule. And she said, well, I have never been fortunate to schedule my child's illnesses or sicknesses. So that pushes me out of this opportunity. She also talked about, well, and when you do schedule, only the child that's scheduled for the appointment can ride. So what does that mean if you have 2 children or 3 children? She said, I can't leave my children home. And she said, because I'll be in another system. And so, and then lastly, she said, there was a time I was successful. I scheduled an appointment 72 hours in advance. And the person came to my door, and I had a young child, and said, where's your car seat? And of course, the person, she said, I didn't have a car, so I didn't have a car seat. And so the person, of course, said, I can't allow you to travel because you don't have a car seat, and left. And so, of course, she was very late for her appointment, and then all that came with being late for that appointment. And so she unpacked how our policies and our practices and our ways of being are just, as Bae said, as Suzanne said, as Dina said, are just baked in, and that we don't even notice that, but we're working to address issues and we don't even know the impact, and that we're not clear about what we're doing and how that shows up. And so it was just a person who experiences how we operate through our policies and our practices and our procedures, how it impacts folks. And so, when I think of systemic racism and institutional racism, it is all about how we're structured and how we operate. And so, that was just some clarity that people know how they're experiencing us in our systems. And are we listening, and are we paying attention?
Great, thank you, Joanne. Judge Frosh, I've got one for you, and then I'm going to invite Dina to wear her dual hat, which is also to dig in and to invite some deep and profound thoughtfulness in the way that we really explore this topic of structural and institutional racism. But I don't think it would come as a surprise, Judge Frosh, if I said to you, so there are not enough judges of any color really that are really talking about structural and institutional racism. And to have a white judge in North Carolina taking the position investing the time, moving across the state and parts of the country, carrying this message is quite unusual. So I want you, if you will, to talk about, because our challenge has been, and I've been in a number of places where literally from the law enforcement, from criminal justice, and from all of those streams connected, mass incarceration or what have you, we just don't have a lot of people talking about race. We have people talking about legitimating law and order, but not talking about how, in fact, there is an unevenness falling on or being burdened or carried, the burden being carried by Black people in particular. So could you kind of center that in how you come to this, how should I say, conclusion and position you've taken?
I think it takes a long time. Something that I've got a story probably similar to Joanne's story about the court system that I can share later about how it plays out. But something that Bay said, and it goes with something that Dina said earlier, I wanted to comment on because I think it really impacts the willingness of people that look like me, white people, to acknowledge institutional racism and what that means. And I call it, maybe I made this up, so it's probably in a book somewhere that I need to read. I got a lot of books on my shelf that I need to read, but I call it the negation effect. And it's like this. So this happened at my family dinner, the Trosh family dinner. It's a bunch of white people on a Sunday. We go every Sunday. And so there was a discussion going on about white privilege and about entitlement. And one of my relatives heard it through a negative lens, which is, listen, like the folks that Bay was talking about that grew up poor in Maine. Wait a minute. I was adopted. My parents weren't together. I put myself through school. I got scholarships. I worked hard, and now you're telling me that everything was given to me and that all these institutions were setting me up for success. Let me tell you something, buddy. I worked my ass off. I worked hard to get where I am. And so it's very difficult because, as Dina said, it's all linked together, right? The Horatio Alger myth, the stories that we tell ourselves in this country. It's very important that I worked hard to get where I am. And if you tell me that institutions assisted me, maybe they assisted Lou Trosh because he's a rich little white boy. Maybe they helped him, but they sure as hell didn't help me. I grew up poor. And the idea is if I acknowledge that I got some help along the way and that the systems were designed for people like me, I may not be answering your question, Monica, I'm sorry, but
Oh, you are.
But people like me got help from those institutions, and the institutions were designed to make sure I had every opportunity to succeed, right? It's hard to keep that in your mind and continue to have in your mind. And by the way, I'm pretty damn smart. I'm cussing too. I hope that's allowed, but I'm pretty smart. I worked hard. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. It becomes an either or, right? So if I acknowledge that institutions are set up in a certain way, then it takes away who I have been told by this country that I am and everything that I've done. And the both and is really hard because it is a both and, right? I am really pretty damn smart and I'm really good looking, even with my bald head, right? And I dress pretty good and I work hard. That can be true. And it can be true that I got some help along the way from systems that were designed for me to succeed. But that both and thinking is really hard. And when you bring that to the criminal justice system, where in addition to that, we view ourselves as, hey, these laws are neutral. They're race neutral. All we're doing is applying these laws in a neutral way. If you can't behave the way you need to behave, that's not my problem. And so that either or thinking, that negation effect exacerbates when you're talking about judges and lawyers and police officers because of the more complicated myths in this society, but very specifically how we view ourselves in that justice system, justice being the word, right? What are you saying, that I'm not just? Is that what you're saying? And that's a hard obstacle to get over. And the only way I got over it was because there are a lot of damn people in Charlotte that pushed me and pulled me and yanked me and educated me until I got the message and was able to hold both of those things in my thick skull at the same time.
Great. I wanna dovetail, and Dina, I need to bring you in now, because you're not just an anomaly, Judge Trosh, because you're white and male and you're a judge and bringing this message. But I want to talk about, and I want to bring Dina in on this, because there are those who believe that if we diversify the courts, we diversify the healthcare systems, Joanne, we diversify even business developers or whatever, that is also the problem solved. And I also have seen across the United States in the last year, in fact, lots of, how should I say, broadcast news, print media news, but, you know, we elected probably in some places a lot more Black officials than we ever did. So we got more judges, we got more DAs, we got more court people, we have maybe a handful of more CEOs, but we still, as Dina said, we still got the problem. So I really want to talk about that, the socialization also. When we're talking about structural and institutional racism, I really now want to dig into the fact that even those of us who are people of color, who may even recognize that it is an unjust system and that we sit on the bottom of it, but that in many ways we're complicit inside of those systems in the way that we, how should I say, the way that we respond, and the way, in fact, that we participate in white organizational culture. So Dina and Suzanne, I particularly want to bring the two of you back in, helping to position that.
Yeah, I think this is really relevant for me as I think about having this analysis and how ineffective I've been in my life without it. Because you know, my explanation, my narrative, my story about why we see what we see in our society wasn't really examined. It wasn't really vetted. It's just maybe what my mom said. It's what I heard from other people. It's what made sense to me. If I saw a predominantly, you know, poor community and they were predominantly Black, you know, I had no way of connecting that to, you know, 350 years of historical exclusion. And so, you know, this idea, or the way in which we begin to, you know, think about how we work inside of our systems. What are the kind of questions that we ask about, you know, as Joanne said, the information that we have, the programs and initiatives that we launch. If we don't bring this perspective into our work, we end up doing more harm than good. I mean, I'm telling you, it is a real struggle. And Judge Trosh, you were there. We presented the groundwater, you know, to a group of law enforcement agents. And this could have been anybody, but this was, I don't know if it was SROs, I don't remember who it was, but I remember a sergeant coming up to me and saying, you know, I'm not buying what you're selling, but the information's undeniable. And so I really just paused there because, you know, he was saying these two things. One is that my narrative and my story is what I've been told all my life, is that your life is what you make it. You know, everybody has opportunities today. All white people weren't born with a silver spoon in their mouth. And this data shows that race is present in every system, and that these outcomes occur across systems. And so it was this converging of those two narratives, you know, those truths and stuff. And so, yeah, it was Judge Trosh. And I didn't even know what to say to him, because, you know, that's the interplay again between, you know, not understanding what cultural and structural racism has created, but seeing the manifestation. And when you don't have that, then any explanation will do. So, so Suzanne, I'll let you weigh in here in answering Monica's question or responding to some of this.
No, I don't have a lot to add. As a white person, someone who's come to be called white, to be able to see this is not as easy as one might imagine. I mean, how can you not see it? On the one hand, there feels a willful ignorance about what's been going on. And on the other, we are, as described, fish in water, that a fish in water doesn't know it's wet. And furthermore, it's really hard for fish to describe the nature of wetness. So the nature of our culture, the things that formed our narratives, the preferences we have as white people that literally built our institutions, built our systems, we don't even see. They're the water. They're the water we swim in, and we swim with ease. So to see that is a journey, and it is it's incumbent upon us as white people, in fact, to do it and to have that understanding that says systems and institutions were designed by and for me. I don't benefit the way perhaps other white people do. I benefit more perhaps than many white people do, but they were designed for my collective. And my job has been, and the job of white people for 300 and something, maybe 400 years almost, has been to ensure that we hold that together, that we don't challenge that. And we've done a good job, and we've done a good job in a very bad way, But now I think we have a moment. We have a way to go.
That moment, Suzanne, actually makes real for me a commentary that was published by Michelle Alexander in the New York Times a few weeks ago. And I really want each of you to respond to it, but not before I position it so everybody know what you're responding to. So the title of her commentary to the New York Times was "America, This Is Your Chance." And more than anything else today, and I've got lots of questions I still have for you guys, but I want each of you to respond to that. If Michelle Alexander, even if you didn't read her commentary, if in fact there is a chance for America in this moment of challenge, people that have taken to the street, the protesters, the Black Lives Matter, and everything over the past at least 6 weeks in this country, I'd like each of you to articulate to me, what do you think is that chance that America has a unique opportunity to capitalize on at this time? I'd like to hear from each of you with regard to that. What is the chance you would define as we move forward and we address structural and institutional racism?
Yeah, we probably should start with Bay, since he has to jump off at 2:30.
Oh,
I saw you smiling, Bay, so I'm ready.
Yeah, that's an easy question. Toss me the easy one, huh? Not that any of these are necessarily easy. I really do struggle back and forth about that, Monica, because I do feel that there's a racial consciousness emerging. I worry that there's not a structural consciousness emerging. And I actually think that sometimes the racial consciousness, the way that emerges, makes it harder to see the structural conversation, if that makes any kind of sense. I mean, we're just like, and it's like there's the sort of obvious ways that it's like, in our town here, it's like there's, the first things that people in power tend to do are like the ones that are very obvious, Indigenous Peoples Day in Maine. It's like, great, we got a holiday, right? It's like paint the crosswalks black, right? Black Lives Matter. It's like, great, we got that. It looks open, it looks, that. And then people like to criticize the people in leadership for making those kinds of moves. But the reality is, if you look at many of the movements, that is the kind of change that a lot of people are asking for. And so I think that's like a risk that we run. It's almost like there's a gentleman who I love, his name is Kenyon Farrow. He says, biggest concern in this moment is that all of the work that you were talking about, Dina, that we've done over decades to build for this moment, that work gets hidden underneath a veneer of racial equity. That used to be kind of a safe place to hang out because nobody would talk about it. And you knew if people were talking about racial equity, they kind of had at least a shred of something sort of deeper going on. And then people started to say that. And then all of a sudden they might be talking about racial equity and you didn't really know if they were really doing what kind of work. But if you said structural racism, you knew some people had to have some kind of understanding. Now it's like someone says structural racism, institutional racism. I'm like, that really tells me nothing about your depth of understanding about power and structure and how it really works. So it's a little bit tricky now, Monica, because everybody's talking about, everybody's doing things. And it's almost like we have to do extra work, like the little shortcuts. I mean, I imagine back 40 years ago, it used to be like, oh, someone who's Black, you know that they're on the right team. Now it's like, hold on a second, you might be Black, you might be queer and white or whatever, and I still have to take a couple steps to kind of figure out where you're at. You know what I mean? And I've had to take myself to figure out where I'm at, but I think that's the tricky part. And then of course, on the other hand, I mean, this is just absolutely extraordinary. I think, you know, part of why I like to say I'm nervous that other people aren't going to get it fast enough is because the reality is I'm nervous that I'm not positioned to take advantage of this moment. And I pray for guidance and hope that we as a collective and a team will find ways to metabolize all of this energy and do something really meaningful with it.
Excellent,
That's my
excellent,
little
Bay.
tip.
And
Yeah.
I know you'll be joining us next week, even though you're gonna have to get off a little early today. So we're not done. And the
Excellent.
questions are only gonna get deeper.
Look forward
But,
to it. I'll be on for a
but
little
how
bit
about
too.
it, Sean? America, don't miss this chance. This is your chance. How does that articulate to you?
You know, Sino ran a virtual series for 8 or 9 weeks, and it was titled The Hard Reset. And really, you know, America has needed a hard reset. And that's really sort of my sort of guiding philosophy these days. And I think that the judge said, and this is something I also say, you know, you got to sip and pour at the same time. So I'm conflicted. While I feel like, you know, I'm optimistic because I try to be optimistic by nature. I also feel like we've been here before. Post Reconstruction, I mean, during Reconstruction, post slavery, we've been here before. You know, on the heels of the Great Depression, when everybody was on their knees, we decided to go in one direction and create a series of programs that were for the benefit of white people. Post World War II, we had opportunities and sort of codified things into law that gave one group an advantage, another group. That was an opportunity for that hard reset. And even more recently, you know, where we had the 2008 or 9 stimulus after the Great Recession in my own hometown of New Orleans, post Katrina, where everybody was wiped out. We sort of provided a headwind, a tailwind for white folks and a headwind for Black folks, and sort of getting up off their knees. And so, you know, in many ways, we have been here before and we've missed it. And so I think there is a hard reality that we have to face. And, you know, Sam Jackson said, Monica, he said, you know, America, the water is broken. Right. I don't know if you've heard that, but and so now here comes the hard part. Right. And so I think that is the question. The water has broken. So what happens next is not going to be easy at all. And so I think that's just the biggest lesson for me, is to sort of, like you said, like Bay said, you know, a lot of awareness, people feeling good, people getting the language right, but are folks willing to do what is hard? And the question I always ask is, you know, what are you willing to give up for this moment? That to me is always sort of the question I ask all of my well-intentioned friends, Black and white. What are you willing to give up? And I think that is a hard question for people to ask. And until we answer it individually, organizationally, and as a collective, I have a hard time seeing us get there, but we do the work nonetheless.
Great, great. Judge Trosh,
Yes.
America, this is your
Well,
chance.
This reminds me of where Race Matters for Juvenile Justice was 20 years ago. And so based on what Sean and Bay just talked about, that my concern is similar, that it's sort of, this is the hot issue of the day. So to explain what happened with RMJJ, we got done with the 2-day workshop, and we came back to Charlotte, and we invited Dina and Suzanne to Charlotte. And we were going to just make some changes to fix disparities in the juvenile court system. And we invited them down for them to give us 5 things to do, right? Tear down the Confederate statues in the courthouse, you know, whatever it is, do these 5 things. We could do those things and then move on. And thank God, Dina and Suzanne said, no, it doesn't work that way. You can't just do 3 things and then check them off and move on. This has to be the way you all operate from now on. And so because of them, we realized we had to be in it for the long haul. And it wasn't a checkbox, do these things and move to the next project. And my worry about the country broader is, where are Dina and Suzanne for the country? And are we going to, nonetheless, they're great steps, right? Confederate statues coming down, renaming, those are all really awesome things. They're good things. I'm not saying they're not, but I'm concerned that we'll satisfy ourselves with doing some, I don't want to say window dressing, but sort of surface level things, and where nobody's going to be there to say, hey, you're just doing this, you're just fixing this, you're not fixing way down here, you're not getting the groundwater. And so, you know, that's what I worry about, is that we'll make a few improvements as we have throughout our history, right? We've made some improvements, but we've never, ever, ever gotten the groundwater fixed. The water's broken.
Great, thank you, Judge. Dina, America, this is your chance. And you've got to articulate that. What's that chance?
Yeah, I always, I think Sean really captured it when he gave those, we had those tipping point moments again, where we had an opportunity to turn the corner. And why do we miss them? And I think one, that the organizing has to be is grounded more now than ever, because that is what is going to sustain the push. And, we talked about before, but Parker Palmer and his Divided No More about educational reform talks about movement-minded people. And movement-minded people aren't about, the quick fix, aren't about the give me the solution, aren't attached to the outcomes, that they make a decision. And that is that I'm deciding right now, I am no longer going to live outwardly in ways that contradict what I say I believe to be the truth inside.
Yes.
And so we have, we have to just ask ourselves, are we ready for that, and what that means? Because that self-reflection and that self-change is challenging. And then he says, when we do that, we're going to find ourselves in the company of people who are doing the same thing, as we are sitting here on this panel. We are finding ourselves in the company of people who have also made that decision about our lives. And then together, we are going to learn to translate these individual issues, the dysfunctional alliance between African Americans and law enforcement, the dysfunctional, experience between kids and, schools, all of these systemic problems and individual problems into the larger structural cultural issue, and to carry that forward. And so I am hopeful that our organizing has turned up so much because of CINO, because of RMJJ, because of Durham organizing against racism in Asheville and Alamance Racial Equity Alliance, and what's happening in Indianapolis and West Palm Beach and Broward County, and all of our organizing partners in Kansas City, all of the people who are doing this. I believe that we are not going to let this slide back. And, there are 404 people listening in on this webinar, and people are looking for something to plug into, and we have to have something ready for them to plug into, because if we don't, then that's how we miss things. And so I am, moving forward, keeping my eyes on the prize. And I know that, the people on this screen and the people that are tuning in and the people that we're all working with in our respective cities, this is who we are, and this is how we live our lives, and this is what we're going to do going forward.
Great, great. Suzanne, America, this is your chance. How does that articulate from your perspective?
I agree that this is a chance. I would ask that we all look at why. I mean, why is this moment our chance? We've had 400 years of enormous disparity, of structural racism, of horror, literal horror and terrorism against Black people and people of color. And so now we have a chance. Why? Why are we seeing things? And why is this moment where it is? And I think that needs to be attributed not to a single source by any means, but in large part because of the organizing that has occurred, that Dina described so well, across this country for a long, long time. People have been carrying this water a long, long time. Hence, this can land somewhere. And the horror of it can be explained by something more than a single individual committing a horrific act. or a series of horrific acts by single people. So I think that's really important, that we acknowledge that we're here because of work that has gone on for a very long time. I remember someone describing being across from the United Nations the day the Soviet Union flag came down and the Russian flag went up. And they said, wow, in an instant. No, it wasn't an instant. It was many, many people's lifetimes. And now we aren't in an instant, we are in a moment. We're at a place in a long, long struggle. And we have opportunities in it as we have had opportunities before. I think we're the people who literally made this the opportunity that it is. All the organizers across the country that Dina described now have a chance to continue doing what they've done for a long time and to pass it on to the next generation and the next, so that we are seeing it with that equity lens, that structural lens, that systemic lens that's going to be so important to make anything different.
Joanne, thank you, Suzanne. I'm gonna flex this a little bit different. I'm not gonna force you to answer that question. I've got one though that still allows you to speak to that. And I want all of you as panelists to imagine that George Floyd was a visible killing. We saw what a system did to an individual, racially motivated. We could see that. We could see Breonna Taylor after the fact. We have seen, and we can call, I could sit here and I could probably call 50 names of the unarmed Black men and women in this country that have been killed. So police in many ways, and teachers, I give police and teachers that their, how should I say, crimes against humanity or the disparities or the injustices, theirs are so visible. But yet there are far more systems of this country that are killing folk. Killing Black folk and people of color that don't, whose crimes are not quite as visible and tangible, and we see. So Joanne, I'm gonna have each of you articulate this out of your institutional relationship. So Joanne, you happen to be situated in healthcare. So what are the disparities, but the crimes, so to speak, of those disparities that exist inside of healthcare that we're not seeing? The losses of life, the lack of situatedness, the lack of access. So could you help us with that?
Sure, I can think of three off the top of my head. One, infant mortality, the infant mortality rate. I can think of just the poor outcomes that Black women have and just the whole birthing experience. And then also when we think of where we are now with COVID-19. So certainly across our nation, African-American babies die at a disproportionate rate. And so we have to figure that out, and often, people come up with these ideas of why that's happening. And we know that it's centered around race, because when they cancel out or rule out that it's our socioeconomic status and our education, all of that, when you look at the data, it shows that race is the racism is the risk factor. And just to be clear, because many have talked about language, that we're hearing a lot of people talk the language of racial equity and using terms, and then just what Bay said, that we have to unpack and be sure that we're really talking about the same thing. So that's one thing where across our country that there's this huge disparity. So babies are dying due to racism. And one of the things that's really important, it's not that race is the risk factor, racism is the risk factor. And that's really important that people understand that. And then when you think about COVID-19, people are looking at that and looking at the disproportionate rate in which Black and brown people are having these poor outcomes as they are compared as they are in the population. And you hear narratives that, well, people, Black and brown people and indigenous people tend to just shows up. And it goes back to what Suzanne said, but why? Asking that question, why? that Black and Brown and Indigenous people tend to have all of these comorbidities or would make them more susceptible, you know? And so it's really important to look at that, and that race is all through that. And that also has exposed, you know, structural racism, as you would say. So I see it, you know, in public health, I see it play out all the time. We have data, but do we examine it? Do we disaggregate it by race and ethnicity to see who's having the best outcomes, who's having the worst? And if we can predict it, we can predict across our systems and in public health who's having the worst outcomes, then we know there's an issue, because it should not be predictable.
Great, thank you. Sean, so, you know, there are folks who never think about the business realm, never think about development, never think about the contracts, the trillions of dollars in contracts that are exchanged every year in this country, and that someone is actually benefiting from those contractual arrangements that actually are funded by our public and tax dollars. So I want you to tell me, what are the ones that we're missing, that we can't see the casualties of literally what's happening inside of the realm of business development in this country?
Oh, I mean, I think that's an exhaustive, list. New Orleans has one of the largest Black banks in the country. I'd even hesitate to sort of say, I think it's maybe a $600 million institution, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to those other institutions and how large they are. When you look at it from the standpoint of, the endowment of my alma mater, Howard University, and, relative to the endowments of a Stanford or Harvard, who manages that money? When you sort of talk about state governments and their pensions, or teachers' pensions. And so, the economic piece of this is just a tsunami. And, I don't know if folks saw the piece by Nicole Hannah-Jones about, reparations, and the Ta-Nehisi Coates, piece, some thought piece about it. I think when that issue, when folks sort of understand the magnitude of the gap, and to be very candid with you, I had to come around on my thinking of the reparations piece, because I don't ever think that necessarily will happen. But I appreciate what Dina says about, don't hop to the solutions of it. I like people to dig into that and analyze it and go deeper on banking and go deeper on real estate, and just to understand before you even hop to any solution, to quantifying it, because I think, it is an overwhelming, but at the same time, thought organizing sort of analysis when you dig deep into it. And so, if I said in a contemporary sense, Monica, I always think about the environmental movement. Louisiana's coastline is disappearing. That's a new industry that is being stood up today, where people of color aren't participating in it at all, right? By just restoring Louisiana's coastline. So not only are there the sort of historic sort of industries and sectors, but they're contemporaneous ones that are happening right now where we aren't engaged right before our eyes. And that to me sort of reflects, as was said, sort of how this thing sort of spins on its own axis, even though we have the lead pipes, even though we live in Cancer Alley and, Baton Rouge to Louisiana, while the petrochemical plants are, even though we are, sort of disproportionately talk about, Joanne said, health outcomes, sort of the toxic stress, environmental conditions that contribute to the comorbidities of Black folks. We're not involved in that as a sector at all. And again, I think that sort of speaks to how this race arrangement, was put together and is designed. So I think that a deeper analysis is required to take a look at just what that looks like. And I think, without calling reparations the solution or getting into the end goal, I think that is a vehicle for delving deeper into that analysis. So I think it's a great vehicle, even if we don't get to that as an end goal.
Excellent, excellent. Dina, what are those invisible casualties of our systems that so many of us never account for? We don't march and protest against them. We don't necessarily write about them in the newspaper in the ways that we often annually, if not monthly, we get to do that with education. We get to do that with law enforcement. But those are the occasional articles that began to lay out and to enumerate the casualties of the other systems and their invisible power.
Yeah, I don't even, I wouldn't say they're invisible. I just say they're hidden in plain sight.
Okay, great.
You know, that information's there. It's taken me 2 years to get child welfare data from our county. 2 years. 2 years to get child welfare data from our county. And while we're protesting and outraged about what's happening nationally and locally in regards to law enforcement, the criminal justice system, we have become sort of silent and complicit and unaware or content with this raging achievement gap, with this, you know, as Joanne talked about, the health disparities. What's happening in our child welfare system? Why are our children being removed from their homes? You know, where's that information? You know, so we've got our systems gap that we're largely unaware of and not organizing around. And then Sean started to talk about the sector gap, which drives the systems gap. We don't, that's so far out of our reach. We're not even in that conversation. So when he's talking about university endowment, look at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill and North Carolina Central. Their endowments, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill has a 5.7 billion, sometimes over $5 billion endowment. And, you know, there's not one Black college and university that makes the top 100 list of the richest colleges based on their endowments. As a matter of fact, you'd have to take the top 10 richest HBCUs, put them together for to come in number 50 on the 100 list.
Right.
We don't even function. We don't have an analysis at that level. You know, we're not sitting here looking at it. Sean talked about, you know, we have mechanics and farmers here, Liberty Bank, One United Bank, Independence Bank, the Black banks, and where's the money going from our school system, from our courts? So it's systems are getting money on the backs of people of color, and then that money's going into white controlled, white structured organizations, and then dispensed inequitably. So, you know, we're aware of the injustices that we see, but we're not aware of the structural arrangement that makes all this thing operate and work. And I think if we don't start sitting down and broadening our analysis and putting all that stuff together, then we're going to end up getting behind programs. And, you know, Suzanne, Nettie Code, Ron Chisholm, you know, all of our elders in this work have said that we're not poor and inequitable because we lack programs and services. You know, we're poor and facing these inequities because we lack power and because of structural racism, which is why we lack power. And then Suzanne further goes on to say that, I'm sorry, I appreciate the community gardens and I appreciate the health outreach workers. I appreciate the people coming and trying to do mammograms in the neighborhood. All that stuff is wonderful. It is not an effective response to structural inequity. You know, and Suzanne says it best, charity is not only it is inappropriate, it is an unacceptable response to structural and cultural racism and to poverty. And so we have to, you know, we have to step up, because if we're not having that conversation at those levels, that stuff, people are sitting in boardrooms having conversation, not even paying any attention to us in the street, because they know this is going to be dealt with, you know, that's going to go away, it's going to dissipate, and this thing is still going to be orbiting, like Sean said.
Well, that you bring up a very valid point, and I'm gonna try to figure out how to articulate it in a way that I need you all to respond to it. And that is that I know right here in Greensboro that one of the things that we have recently come to understand is that many of our millennials who have marched, who are out there, who have waged and lifted up their voices, you know, in opposition to racism and racist structures. But we also know that when they laid out a course of action, demands that, you know what they demanded, Suzanne? More programs. Our young millennials who have waged and lifted up their voices in opposition to racism and racist structures, when the demands were laid out, if you look and read those demands, they were demanding more programs. So here's the question of the day for you now is, how do we speak to the millennials who are demanding more programs that are not going to solve our problems? They're actually asking for more charity. And I just need, you know, and however we accomplish that, but I need to hear from you all. How do we close that gap of understanding that we don't, programs have not changed the course, and you all have laid that out eloquently here, But now what I need is for us to figure out how is it that we position that so that some of the young bodies, and it's always been the youth of this country who've laid their bodies on the line, but how do we get them to carry a message that's more structural in its nature?
They're swimming in the water, Monica. So that's all they know, right? So we live in a world where we're told that we're going to program our way out of everything. So it's a whole paradigm shift that's required, which goes back to everything that we've been talking about, which to me, and one of the things we're talking about in RMJJ is whether the most important step is to change the curriculums in schools so that people understand how all of this stuff plays together, how the history works, so that we can create a different paradigm. And I think until we do that and we try and live under the same paradigm that we've had for 400 years, we're going to continue to get the same results. So we've got to do something to shake up the paradigm.
Hey, Monica, can I add this? I think, here's where sort of the demographic change is going to be interesting, right? You have this sort of browning country, and the majority of, I think, first graders for the last 7 or 8 years have been kids of color. So, part of it's not a direct answer to your question, but I do wonder what the demographic impacts may be on the country. And, it'd be terrible if we went to a straight apartheid system where, it was controlled by race and that devolved. But I sort of wonder what the demographic impacts may be as kids realize this narrative, as they get the authentic history of how this country came to be, and at the same time, in just raw numbers, are sort of moving into the world and sort of matriculating through institutions and systems. I'm kind of hopeful from that standpoint.
Excellent, thank you.
And I would just say, when we talk about that, America, this is our chance. We need a huge convening to really institutionalize racial equity with the same strategy and intention and precision in which inequities were built. And that we need to really share foundational understanding of the why, as Suzanne mentioned before. Otherwise people will, because as you imagine, if I'm in public health and that human health and human services world, I'm swimming, drowning even in programs and services. And we know that they are inadequate, and that they will only at some point only touch or help momentarily a person in need. And that's not what we need. But if that's all we can come to, it's problematic. But, when you just talk about the millennials, I think it's every generation, because we've learned how to, just like just Trosh said, people have learned how to do this. We've been trained to do these things. We get promoted if we do them. We get paid because we do them. And we have to, as I always hear you all say, be critical lovers of our systems and institutions and really talk about what needs to change, but that we need a national conversation so that there's some racial clarity so that we really can stay in this moment. I want to continue in this moment. I know people are probably trying to move away from it, but I want to stay here in this space so that we do not miss this. This is a chance of a generation, of a lifetime, and we really have to do it. And then I'm just reminded of a researcher who says that, we're on a ship, a big ship, and we're headed towards an iceberg. And those of us, many of us, are on the deck rearranging the furniture. And that's not going to move us away from that iceberg. So we have a moment, and as many as we can, to just really change the trajectory of our society, because we have never, ever in the time of this country beginning have ever had racial equity, ever.
What I want to do with the few minutes that we have left, and I want to remind folks that this same panel is going to be with us next week, so we're not done. This is the beginning of we've chipped the top off, but we've got to go deep down to the real rocks in this. And but Wanda, if you will, maybe 1 or 2 questions can close us out as we move towards next week. Are there some that I saw lots of commentary, Not sure how many questions I saw. Are you still with us there, Wanda?
I am. So one question that hasn't been addressed in the Q&A or the chat. Are we in need of a national leader, another Martin Luther King? I see advocators in their own neck of the woods making some progress, but do we need a national leader who will better unify us for real change?
Well, I think we got that story wrong. I think we get a lot of those stories wrong, right? You know, Rosa Parks was tired. You know, MLK was the leader. You know, that those brilliant you know, legends were part of movements. I mean, when we start digging into those stories, the details will give you chills about you know, how things got started and how long things, you know, were in place before people emerged. So all we see, and, you know, people have told us that our kids, that's what they get during Black History Month. You know, they get color Martin Luther King. If you walk down any elementary school, you'll see 40 pictures of Martin Luther King, all colored and the little kids' names on them. You'll see Rosa Parks, she was just tired one day. So part of that is this sort of myths around movement people, you know, movements period, and how they got, you know, what's all a part of that. And so, so I would just invite us to go back and learn about, you know, Ella Fitzgerald, and learn about the Highlands and Highlander organizing, you know, institute in Tennessee, and all the Children's March, you know, and Birmingham, Alabama, and, you know, just all of the history of how these things started. We didn't end slavery because, you know, somebody stood up and said, hey, you know, this is wrong. You know, I'm going to step out here. That's I think that's what gets us in trouble, is we think it's on the shoulders of one individual. You know, we just need a person to stand up and to lead us somewhere. And that's a setup, you know. So anyway, I think we have what we need in place for things to change.
One last question, Wanda.
The other question is, for anyone who wants to respond, how has the pandemic contributed to this moment?
I'll jump in. I think part of it is we're all at home. I think that's just so profound. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I kind of hope never to be at home with them for 4 months straight ever again. But I think this is just such a unique moment in our history. And so there certainly is the front end piece that, you know, it disproportionately affected people of color, and Black people in particular, disproportionately killing the economics of it. But in an American society where, and it's why I'm a little nervous if sports come back, does that take our mind off of things? But rarely in American society have we ever been drawn to sort of focus on one thing at one time. And I think that also makes this a very unique moment, as Dina said, just from a movement standpoint, setting aside some of the ramifications.
I would echo and say that it also is exposing the inequities, and it's taken the carpet that we lay over everything is being pulled back, and we're seeing now how unequal our society is in ways that we can't hide it now. And so I think that's adds to the moment.
Absolutely. Suzanne, Joanne?
I just think that the COVID pandemic really exposed that we have a pandemic within a pandemic. And so call it what you will, but I think just what Sean said, the pause button of all of us moving around, busy, doing whatever we're doing on the deck of that ship, it caused us to just pause and pay attention and say, hey, what's going on? Because every day we could have every week there's a George Floyd. And so it just caused us to just pause, pay attention, and look at what's happening. So, and really help facilitate this moment.
Thank you. Suzanne?
I think it has I agree with what everyone said. It has everything to do with it, everything. It is painful to shine that light as strong as that spotlight has been from COVID on what is going on in this country. It just illuminated the disparity in such profound ways. And it also, I think, helped us, many people, understand that absent the change in our structures, anything that comes to us will have similar results. It will disproportionately advantage white people. It will disproportionately disadvantage people of color. And it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's the next pandemic or this one, or, you know, the hurricanes and the floods and the earthquakes and the things that we experience.
Thank you, Susan. I'm told, Judge Trosh, that Wanda has the last question is directed to you. So can we give you that question?
I asked Wanda to direct it to him, not the person asking the question.
Which question was that one?
Question is, I would love to see more racial equity partners identifying as organizers. Can you provide common language for others in their role as organizers? So, you know, Judge Trosh is, you know, a white male, you know, privileged judge. And, you know, I can tell you, he was not a piece of cake in our first workshop. So, you know, we're very proud of his journey, and, you know, his conversations with himself and his co-lead, the Honorable Elisa Chingari, about, you know, who he is as an organizer. So I just wanted him to say a little bit about that.
I will say that I had no intentions whatsoever. I like to work on different projects, and this was a project. I saw a problem. A lot of us saw a problem, and I was naive, blissfully ignorant enough to figure, oh, we can solve in, you know, in 6 months or a year, a couple years, all this problem and move on. And Elisa Chingari, our clerk of court now, she was in a different position then, but she's now our clerk of court in Mecklenburg County, and I looked across desk at each other and said, are they telling us that we're supposed to like organize stuff? We're not organizers. We work in the court system. And over time, I noticed that Judge McCoy Mitchell was on this. I saw her chat in the chat group a minute ago, but with people like her and others, we came to see that we are also organizers, and we call ourselves now institutional organizers, because and Elisa says it better than I can. She says, do it where you live, make the changes where you live. And I think when you all were talking about leadership, that's the key. It's sometimes it's a cop-out looking for the Messiah to come and tell us what to do. All the great changes really, as Dina said, are based on people coming together and laying groundwork for years and years. And then when those leaders or the people that we end up coloring their pictures or whatever step forward, there's something for them to move forward with. And for us, we realize that we damn well are organizers, and that we are organizing I'm organizing within the court system. I'm sure Joanne is organizing within the health system in Durham, and Sean is organizing within the real estate and the business community in New Orleans. And so that's what we determined. I think all of us really should consider ourselves organizers, even if it's just the organizer of your own family dinner on Sunday when you have these conversations. So I now think that I am a organizer. It took me a long time to get here, Dina. But
Me too, Judge. They twist your arm on that, but I'm the same way.
So it is that hour, and I want to invite everybody who's been here today to come back next week, where we'll have the same panel. We might even have some surprises, but we'd love you to come back, because we really just started. We're about only a quarter of an inch deep in a conversation about structural and institutional racism. So thank you, and the time will change next week, so be sure to check your registration confirmation. We're having to move it to the evening, largely because of REI's work, and many of us are committed as trainers during the day. So your time will change, but we certainly hope you'll put your alarms up and that we can see you back next week. I want to thank Suzanne Plissick, Judge Louis Trosh Jr. I want to thank Sean Barney, Joanne Pierce, Dina Hayes, Bay Love, and I always want to thank our support with whom we could not do without, and that's Wanda LeGrand. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful day and a 4th of July weekend. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye.